UNRWA. And I want to address the first question to Jehad Abusalim. So UNRWA was founded in 1949, just a year after the Nakba, or the catastrophe in which Palestinians were displaced, millions of Palestinians were displaced, and thousands killed. So can you share a little bit about the inception of UNRWA, how it was established, how it began as a United Nations agency, and how was the US involved in its founding?
Sure. The United States has played an important role in defining and shaping the reality on the ground in Palestine, politically and in many other aspects, and not just the US government. And before UNRWA was established in 1949 and began its operations in 1950, a very important American organization played a pivotal role on the ground, especially in the Gaza Strip, following the Nakba, the catastrophe. That is the event that led to the establishment of the State of Israel, following the expulsion of 750,000 plus refugees from their ancestral home, from their cities, towns, and villages across Mandate Palestine, historic Palestine, the area located between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean Sea. So initially, the American Friends Service Committee, which is a Quaker organization, and I worked with AFSC for a few years before I moved to the Jerusalem Fund. AFSC was asked by the United Nations to provide emergency relief to Palestinian refugees. And that request was in recognition of AFSC's experience in humanitarian aid and its Quaker principles of peace and humanitarian services. And of course, that wasn't an easy task for AFSC, despite the experience of Quakers in providing aid and relief during the First World War, during the Second World War. So AFSC faced significant operational challenges due to the scale of displacement of Palestinians and of course the complex political situation that has emerged as a result of the 1948 war and conquest of Palestinian land. And one important aspect of the experience of AFSC, and in a minute I will talk about why I'm talking about AFSC before I talk about UNRWA, but this is important context. While AFSC was primarily involved in humanitarian efforts, it also advocated for the rights of refugees, including the right of Palestinians to return to their homes, as stipulated in UN General Assembly Resolution 194, which was passed in December of 1948. And this resolution called for the refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors to be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. However, Palestinian refugees were not allowed to return. And this is important because we cannot understand UNRWA and its role if we do not understand this context. And the 1948 expulsion of Palestinian refugees was not just an event of people moving across territory. It was an event that led to the transformation of the lives of hundreds of thousands of people who lived in cities, who lived in villages, who were urban craftsmen, worked in textile, worked in different industries, or were part of Palestine's large peasant/farmer population, people who lived in self-sufficient villages, and who for decades, for centuries, had a sophisticated economic life revolving around the land and their connection with it. So suddenly, hundreds of thousands of people are removed from their land, are removed from their livelihood, and war wasn't foreign to this part of the world. Palestine historically has been situated at the crossroads of empires, conquerors, and armies that pass from Asia to Africa and vice versa. So historically, during times of crisis, natural disasters, wars, invasion, conquests, people who move within that territory historically were able to go home. But what happened in 1948 was set up something that was unprecedented in Palestinian history, that people following the conclusion of hostilities as a result of a war were not able to return. And AFSC, the American Friends Service Committee, was aware that their role as a relief agency was temporary, and they were really frustrated. If you look at their archives in Pennsylvania, not very far from here, you look at the correspondence, all the writing that their staff circulated from the ground to the US and amongst themselves. They were really frustrated with the fact that and they were also grappling with the fact that the refugeehood status of Palestinians, the state of refugeehood, seemed to have become or started to become a permanent reality. And in that context, there was a transition to UNRWA from AFSC. So in 1950, when UNRWA was established, AFSC handed over its responsibilities to this new UN agency, which is different than UNHCR. And of course, Bill is here, and he's given that he works with UNRWA, he's more experienced than I am in terms of talking about the scope of the mandate of the organization and its role and what and its responsibility vis-a-vis the Palestinian people it supports, the refugees, but also as a humanitarian organization that emerged in this post-World War context. So UNRWA becomes unique in terms of its mandate, which is to provide support, humanitarian relief, and it's education, healthcare, social services, employment opportunities to Palestinian refugees to facilitate their well-being. And again, it's important to remind everyone here that initially, when Palestinians moved away from hostilities during the 1948 war, and even after they were expelled by Israeli forces, many of them wanted to go home after the war ended. For them, no group on earth, including Palestinians, would want to live in refugee camps for eternity. And in this context, Gaza is a very important part of this history, because the Gaza Strip, which emerges as a geographic entity as a result of the 1948 war, it was a strip of land that remained as part of a broader Gaza district, but the majority of the refugees who ended up there were expelled from villages and towns that are in the vicinity of the Gaza area. And those people lost their livelihood. So they ended up in Gaza as refugees, and then UNRWA becomes an important provider for them, given that they lost their livelihood. So I think it is very important to establish that, and I'm happy to add later to this context, which I hope I will be able to explain in full today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jehad, for that important context, and also establishing the difference between UNRWA and the United Nations, UNHCR, and how UNRWA provides many more services and opportunities for Palestinian refugees. Thank you. And now I'm going to turn to Bill Deere, again, director at the UNRWA Washington office. So the question is for you. So after 18 donor countries suspended funding for UNRWA, the US, of course, being the largest donor, and it's confronting the largest humanitarian crisis in the organization's 75-year history. So what can we expect right now regarding the suspension of the funding? Will it become permanent? And when can we expect to know updates on this decision?
Well, thank you, and thanks for the invitation to join you today. Currently, I believe it is 16 nations, including the United States, are on pause. Just off the top of my head, this represents about 70% of the contributions that we received in 2023. The situation is a little more nuanced, particularly for our Hill staff folks. There are, in response to the Israeli allegations concerning a dozen UNRWA employees, there are two things going on simultaneously. The highest level investigative staff of the United Nations, the American equivalent of the Inspector General, is on the ground and investigating the allegations. They were to make an interim, they've been on the ground for a couple of weeks. They have to make an interim report to the Secretary General, and then they will issue a final report about a month later. There is a second group that's actually working, which is an independent review of the agency that's being led by former French Foreign Minister Colonna. And that we'll see something, an interim report from them by the end of March, and final report, we believe, by the end of April. So with respect to many donor states, they're waiting for the results of those two products. There's a somewhat different issue here in the United States, which, and folks don't always, Hill staff will get this, of course, but it's not always a question of whether the U.S. will come back following the investigations. We're confident in what we do and how we do it. There's always room for improvement, but we're confident about what's going to come out of these investigations. But the issue is, will the administration be allowed to fund UNRWA? And that, of course, is a decision that is made by the Congress as part of the appropriations process. Having worked both on the Hill and at the State Department, you know, folks don't always realize that Congress is a separate but equal branch of government. And to quote Mrs. Lowy, former chairman of the committee, you know, Congress writes the check. So for the United States, there's two issues. The pause, returning from the pause is one issue, but the more immediate issue is various proposals on Capitol Hill to prohibit U.S. funding to UNRWA at all.
Thank you for that. I have to make sure I follow properly on my spotlights of our speakers. Thank you so much. And as you said, Congress writes the check, and which is why we are hosting this webinar today. So thank you so much for our attendees. Thank you so much for joining us. Now, next question for Jehad. When UNRWA began, can you tell us about how Palestinians responded to UNRWA's establishment, and how has that changed over time? If we can keep this to 3 to 4 minutes, and then so we can have an active discussion. Thank you.
Sure. I think so. When UNRWA was first established, Palestinians, of course, needed it. They realized that this is an organization that was responding to a very dire situation. I mean, we talk about the Nakba now, the catastrophe, in abstract terms, but if you look into the details of what was happening on the ground, the state of the large-scale human misery that unfolded as a result of expelling hundreds of thousands of refugees in Palestine, especially in Gaza, the situation in the refugee camps was dire. The people died from starvation and disease, and the lack of access to hygiene, and the winters of 1948 and 1949 were really, really difficult. And I think, you know, if just look at the scale of the disaster that's happening now in Gaza, and I think, which is, you know, we have 2.3 the number of Palestinian refugees who were expelled in 1948. So I think that provides us with a glimpse into what the reality also was then like. So when UNRWA comes into existence and starts providing relief for these refugees, that was much needed support, because again, those were people who for decades lived in, as peasants or as urban residents, and they had their sources of income and livelihood, and all of a sudden they lost them, and they ended up in refugee camps and in places that did not necessarily have the capacity to provide for these people. At the same time, the relationship between the Palestinian people as a whole and their national and political organizations and formations, in general, Palestinians, while they welcomed UNRWA and its contribution, at the same time, for Palestinians, they don't want to be in a constant state of refugeehood. However, and this is where the issue of a just political resolution comes in. The understanding is that, if UNRWA's role cannot be terminated, cannot be concluded without solving the fundamental issue, the root of the problem that caused the state of refugeehood and the need for hundreds of thousands of Palestinians to rely on UNRWA's aid and support. And that had to do with the issue of the right of return. So what could be done in order to conclude UNRWA's role, which is very important? This cannot be done without a solution that guarantees the return, dignity, and ability of those hundreds of thousands of people who have been deprived of their homes, of their lands, of their property, of their bank accounts, of their jewelry, of their everything they owned and everything they maintained for decades and centuries. This cannot be resolved without addressing the question of why there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians trapped in refugee camps, and the political context that led to it, and the set of decisions and kinds of politics that are normalized that allowed for the Palestinian refugee question to persist that long. And Israel's refusal to allow people to go home, and the international community's inability and failure to address the Palestinian refugee question has been at the core of that. So for Palestinians, UNRWA is an important organization. They welcome it. Sometimes they criticize it. They have a complicated relationship with it. But at the same time, what matters for them is that any conversation about UNRWA cannot be detached from the question of from the political questions related to this conflict, and also the need for a vision that takes into consideration the immense injustice that has befallen Palestinians in 48 and after.
Thank you so much for highlighting that and highlighting the importance of connecting the root cause of the issue and the need for UNRWA. And I want to highlight again, as I shared in the beginning of the call, for those who didn't hear, 3 additional members of Congress have called for a ceasefire this week: Senator Warnock, Senator Sanders, and Representative Madeline Dean. And that is what IMEU continues to advocate for, is for members of Congress to call for a ceasefire. That is what's first and foremost, that is what's most necessary. So the next question is for Bill Duray. Now, I'm sure you've visited UNRWA schools, health clinics many times over the years. Can you share with us some stories of the people that you've met during your time there, whether doctors or patients or students or teachers? We'd love to hear a personal story.
Oh, look, I muted myself. Okay, here we are, and we're back. So UNRWA is unique, kind of a unique animal in the UN system, as Jehad referenced, in that we're an operational agency. In other words, we don't write checks to other people to do things. We run a school system. We run a network of health clinics. Prior to October 7th, we provide social services, but prior to October 7th, for example, we provided food assistance to 1.2 million Gazans. So, with that as backdrop, you do in your time working with the agency, what's always impressed me about the place, particularly as a former Capitol Hill staffer, is that this is a remarkable group of folks, because what they do is they get quantifiable results on a very cost-effective basis. Now, you go to these schools because of budget cuts, to the agency, but what you see is, more kids in a classroom, approaching, 50 kids in a classroom these days. But our test scores and cost per student, our test scores, this isn't just me patting myself on the back. This is the World Bank and UNHCR. Our kids, generally speaking, finish are averaging a year ahead of their host country counterparts. And to talk about personal stories, actually one of the most effective personal stories I recall is what actually occurred here in Washington. So UNRWA runs a series of school parliaments, and it's part of our human rights conflict resolution tolerance program. This includes school parliaments, field parliaments. We operate in 5 fields: Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, West Bank, and Gaza, and then an UNRWA writ large school parliament. And every few years, we're able to bring a couple of these extraordinary young students over here. They speak at the United Nations, and when we get the opportunity, we ask them to come down here to Washington. And I was just, I'd like to say that anything good in Washington for UNRWA happens because of me, but the truth is, my best salespeople are these young folks. Their meetings with folks like Mrs. DeLauro or Mrs. Lowy and others are just the best possible example of what effective and cost-efficient humanitarian and human development response really looks like. And these are tough places. I've been to Gaza, and frankly, I've been told I won't obviously recognize the place the next time I go. But some of these places all over are just tough. I think some of the most desperate circumstances I've seen are the refugee camps in Lebanon, for example, in Beirut. And to see, these kids excel under these conditions, hungry to be educated, it's just extraordinary. And I also want to talk a little bit, if I might, about the effort ongoing right now in Gaza. UNRWA has 30,000 staff. That's not a surprise, because after all, when you run a school system for 500,000, you're running a healthcare network, when you're delivering social services, that's a very large organization that's required to deliver the services. And right now, the largest of our employee fields was Gaza at 13,000. Right now, 3,000 UNRWA employees are showing up on the job every day. And it's just extraordinary what they're doing right now. The field director told me one day that his driver shows up late and he's apologizing. And of course, to the field director, that's no big deal. But it turned out that the gentleman had lost his granddaughter in an airstrike the night before. Still shows up for work the next day. Virtually every one of our 3,000 staff still working have been displaced at least once. It's just an example that absolutely blew me away about the effectiveness of our response. We were told that we had to evacuate Western Khan Yunis. I guess it was about 2 weeks ago. We had to leave behind warehouses, healthcare, shelters. And within 24 hours, we had reestablished ourselves closer to the coast. And that became incredibly important. And here's why. Because a desperate situation just continues to grow more desperate. As folks responded to the IDF call to leave Western communists, they had to pass through military checkpoints. They literally had to leave everything that would not fit in a backpack or a bag behind. So at these checkpoints, there, what's left of their personal goods is littering the side of the road because they're only allowed to bring out a backpack worth of stuff. So within like a day or so, we had already re-registered 185,000 people who, if it was humanly possible, his condition was even worse than 48 hours earlier. And our folks are responding to this terrible tragedy and working at just extraordinary highest levels of ability. And I think that needs to be acknowledged. So thank you.
Thank you so much for that very thoughtful response. It's really incredible to see the work that these individuals, thousands, are doing despite losing income, losing families, and that's really what keeps us going here, is their strength. So thank you so much for sharing that. And now the question for Jehad Abusalim. So some have said that Israel's sudden unfounded investigation was in response, or perhaps even in retaliation, to the international community and the ICJ court order that was to cease all hostilities in Gaza. That was, of course, a ruling that Israel is committing plausible acts of genocide. And the court ordered Israel to cease all hostilities. So would you agree that it was, in fact, in retaliation? And why would Israel specifically punish UNRWA?
Of course, it was in retaliation, but the assault on UNRWA precedes what happened in the wake of the ICJ decision, and this disdain for UNRWA has to do with Israel's contempt for the persistence of the Palestinian refugee question. And the Palestinian refugee question is portrayed as a form of irrational rejectionism on the part of Palestinians who want to stand in the way of Israel being a Jewish majority state. But at the same time, there is a lack of recognition of the historical impact that the expulsion of hundreds of thousands of refugees and then rendering them into people who reside in these refugee camps for eternity without a political horizon, without a possibility of resolution and a recourse that would allow them to reclaim what was theirs and reclaim their dignity and honor as a people, be able to go to their lands, reclaim their property, and reimagine their lives beyond just being condemned to life as refugees for eternity. So there is this disdain, there is a contempt on the part of Israel and its allies for the organization. But at the same time, this organization was first established and supported by Western countries that in the 50s were concerned that Palestinian refugee camps, and this is, of course, this can be read and found and examined in the very meeting minutes of American policymakers in the 1950s who decided that they would want to support the organizations. They were worried that Palestinian refugee camps would become contexts for politics that the United States did not necessarily like or endorse in the 1950s. So yes, it was in retaliation, and I also think that it's not just UNRWA that's being threatened. I think the very rules-based order, the very post-World War legal and humanitarian order is being threatened by these vengeful acts that undermine the very system that's supposed to hold state actors accountable for how they conduct themselves, especially in the context of warfare and when dealing with the lives of millions of people. So I think this is a very cynical and a very dangerous precedent that does nothing but undermine the very institutions that emerged as after the Second World War to prevent large-scale atrocities from happening to people. And I think, again, you know, the Palestine is a prime example of what happens when Western countries decide that international law is irrelevant and international organizations are irrelevant, and not only that, they also go on and become complicit with Israel in its campaign to undermine these organizations, without offering a political horizon, without recognizing the political roots of this problem and the injustices that surround it. So on one hand, they want to destroy UNRWA, they want to undermine it, they want to empty it of its role and its meaning and its purpose. But at the same time, for them, it seems to me it would be acceptable for Palestinians to dwell in misery under occupation forever. So I think this is reflective of how pathetic the politics around this issue have become in the West, and the need for a new kind of politics that's rooted in courage and in recognizing that this approach hasn't worked, it did not succeed, pressuring Palestinians does not necessarily work, and that there is a need for a different vision moving forward.
Thank you so much, Jehad. I definitely want to ask you more about that different vision moving forward, and so we'll circle back to that. First, going back to Bill Deere, I want to ask you about the oversight procedures, since that is really the topic here that has led us to this point and this moment right now. Can you share about the UN oversight procedures of UNRWA programs, staff, and educational materials?
Sure, but let me just, before I begin there, I just want to pick up on Jehad's point. The Commissioner General of UNRWA wrote to the UN General Assembly last week, and he did note that since the ICJ ruling, there's been a concerted effort by some Israeli officials to conflate UNRWA with Hamas, to disrupt our operations and call for the dismantling of the agency. Anyone who is interested, and Philippe goes on to list about 8 things that have transpired for us in this regard since the ICJ ruling. Anyone who's interested in this and other, I really ask them to take a look at UNRWA, UNRWA.org. There is just all sorts of content on there on the front page that you'll find helpful, spotlighting the people who are in the trenches doing the work right now under terrible conditions. We put out on a couple of almost daily basis, it feels like now, situation reports on what's going on and how we're responding. This Commissioner General's letter to the General Assembly. And, you know, why did the Commissioner General write that letter? Because we operate under our mandate from the UN General Assembly. And when there are concerns about our ability to meet that mandate, the Commissioner General is obligated to report to the bosses about what's going on. And I do appreciate the question about the things that we do to ensure our neutrality as a UN agency operating in, you know, let's be honest, one of the most politically charged parts of the world. Because there is no detractors are often pretty shameless about twisting and misleading people about the things that we do. Let me just give you a few examples. For example, they will talk about how UNRWA has tunnels under its facilities in Gaza. Now, how did they know that? Because UNRWA found the tunnels. UNRWA demarched the de facto authority and the Palestinian authority. UNRWA notified the Israelis. UNRWA put out a press statement to the world about what's going on. UNRWA staff, at some level of personal risk, then follow up and inject cement into these tunnels. They talk about finding arms in UNRWA facilities. Again, how do we know that? Because we found them. We informed the Israelis. We publicly let folks know what we found. We called in the UN Mine Action Service to come in and safely dispose of these weapons. We demarched the de factos and the Palestinian Authority. Yet you notice with detractors that you only hear half that story. They neglect to mention that we were the ones who found them and that we were the ones who took action. Similarly with textbooks, there's a certain level of irony to all of the debate about UNRWA education. UNRWA education is based on UN values and UNESCO standards. Now, it is true that it is considered a best practice in refugee education to use the textbooks of the home country. And in our case, it's not only a best practice, it's necessary. We teach to 9th grade, and children have to take national exams to enter the higher levels of education. But detractors are very quick not to mention what we do. We actually review every page of every textbook. Yes, that's 13,000 pages, and look for material that is outside of UN standards, UNESCO standards, age appropriateness, and it comes out to about 3 to 4% at most of content, parts of 3 to 4% of the pages. What do? We identify the content, and then we have a range of ways that we deal with it. Some of the more controversial material, we tell the teachers, flip the page and keep moving. In other cases, we ask the teachers to enter into a discussion about the issue at hand with the children. So there is a certain level of irony to being attacked at one level for using the textbooks of the host country, while in the same bit of legislation also being cited as an expert on what's in the textbooks of the host country. Similarly, all UNRWA employees, all UNRWA beneficiaries, all UNRWA contractors, all UNRWA subcontractors are all reviewed biannually against the UN Security Council Coordinated Sanctions List. Now, as we saw, last month in January, there are allegations that 12 of our employees may be have been directly associated with the tragic events of October 7th. And of course, the UN Inspector General is looking into that right now. But it wasn't because we turned a blind eye. And I think it's a little disingenuous, to say the least, of some of the folks who, again, don't tell the entire story. Namely, UNRWA shares its employee lists annually with the host countries. That includes Israel. So before January, we had never, ever heard from the Israeli government any concerns about UNRWA employees. So in the suspension of disbelief that goes on here, apparently an underfunded UN agency is supposed to do a better job in this respect than one of the world's most sophisticated intelligence services. So there's a great deal of misinformation out there. But I can assure you, as our boss, Philippe Lazzarini, says, and I think he puts it best, this is not a part of the world where a UN agency operates at zero risk, but it will be a UN agency that operates with zero tolerance of neutrality violations. And believe me, when they come to our attention, they're investigated and action is taken.
Thank you so much for that, Bill. I learned a lot personally that I didn't know, especially, that the protocols and procedures are that detailed of reviewing every page of every textbook. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. Now, I want to turn to Jehad. I know I told you that I want you to talk about the new politics and different vision for the world. But before we go into that and take the bigger picture, I want to kind of stay a little focused on the issues that Bill was touching on, and the way that the services and UNRWA is so essential to Palestinian refugees, not just in Gaza, not just in the West Bank, but also in Syria, Jordan, and Syria and Jordan and Lebanon. So I want to ask you, there are, of course, 28 international NGOs who've declared a statement that UNRWA is going to fill such a void that cannot be replaced by other agencies working in Gaza. And if the funding suspensions are not reversed, then we may see a complete collapse of the already restricted humanitarian response in Gaza. So what will that mean for international humanitarian organizations that can't fill that void behind if UNRWA is permanently collapsed and shut down?
In order to answer this very important question, we have to ask ourselves, what is the void that we're talking about? In 2012, the United Nations predicted that Gaza would become unlivable by 2020, and we are now in 2024. And when the UN said in 2012 that Gaza would become unlivable, then that was a context that preceded the destructive 2014 assault on Gaza and the worsening of the blockade. That was just 4 years into Israel's blockade of Gaza. So they anticipated the unlivability of the Gaza Strip based on the patterns that they dealt with then. So imagine the situation now. I mean, even before the war started, the Gaza Strip, home to 2.2 million people, 70% of whom are refugees, living in 8 refugee camps that are some of the most densely populated areas on Earth. And historically, the Gaza Strip, as I mentioned earlier in the brief but detailed context that I tried to establish in the beginning, the Gaza Strip is a very small region. It's 40 kilometers by 12 or 6 kilometers at its 12 kilometers at its widest and 6 kilometers at its narrowest. You can drive from Rafah in the very south to Beit Hanun in the north in just 40 minutes, 30 minutes. It's a very small territory. It doesn't have resources to offer the natural resources or the resources that are required for the survival of this large number of people. And although Palestinians in Gaza are resourceful and productive and love to work, and before the war started, the unemployment, especially amongst youth, university graduates, hit one of the highest rates in the world. You were talking about 50%, 50 to 60% unemployment within a population that had like a 1% illiteracy rate. So this is all now. All of these conditions have intensified in ways that we haven't experienced ever. The very foundations of society in Gaza are destroyed. Schools are destroyed. Universities are destroyed. The infrastructure that allows human life to exist, not just flourish, to exist, merely exist, has been destroyed. The city of Gaza, most of its neighborhoods are gone. Mosques, universities, schools, churches. So when we talk about the work of humanitarian organizations on the ground now, we're not talking about the pre-genocide efforts that help to address some of these problems. No matter what they do now, it's going to be very difficult to catch up with this disaster. Just today we saw how the Israeli forces killed more than 100 people who were just trying to line up for flour in northern Gaza and in Gaza City. And of course, the conditions in Rafah are just beyond pale. 1.4 million people are trapped in a small town with now the population density in Rafah now exceeds 22,000 people per square kilometer. So the scale of the calamity of the disaster on the ground is beyond pale, and to assault UNRWA at this moment adds to it would be a direct contribution to Israel's efforts. And since the beginning of Israel's campaign against Gaza, I said this wasn't a campaign to engage Hamas or the other factions like the Israelis claim. This was a campaign to empty Gaza of its residents, hence the attacks on Gaza's institutions, on Gaza's important and vital institutions, including hospitals, which are supposed to be a refuge for the most vulnerable against us. Israel attacked hospitals. Why? If you get to the level where you attack hospitals, you are signaling that life should not be possible in a given place. So attacking UNRWA now, which is providing essential support for Palestinians on the ground, especially Gaza's majority refugee population, will contribute to Israel's efforts to empty Gaza of its residents. And for those who don't necessarily, I think, and I'm making a moral argument here, Palestinians should not be expelled from their homes. We've seen how that played out since 1948. But if people were not wouldn't want to care about this for moral reasons, I fail to imagine how emptying Gaza of its residents or pushing them to the Sinai will bring about any form of stability in the region, or will make peace in the region or stability more possible. We are dealing with a government in Israel that is acting in a way that will not create any hope or any horizon for the people of the region. So once again, UNRWA's roles is life-saving, and any assault on it would contribute directly to Israel's genocide, and that will have consequences that will be very, very difficult to grapple with in the years and decades to come.
Thank you so much, Jehad, for always bringing us back to the root and making the connection between the attacks on Palestinians and the need for humanitarian assistance. So it's always necessary, again, to keep that in mind. Now I'm turning again to Bill DeRay, the UNRWA chief. I think you just mentioned him briefly ago. Felipe Lazzarini has called the suspension of funding an additional collective punishment for Palestinians under nonstop Israeli bombardment. So can you say more about that? And also just also adding in how this collapse could affect the Palestinian refugees, again, across the region from Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, the West Bank, and especially in the Gaza Strip. And if you could maybe keep it to 2 to 3 minutes, and then we can give a final word to Jehad and close. Thank you.
Sure, and I will be brief. Yes, Philippe said that, and as I indicated earlier, he in his letter to the General Assembly, he was very specific that the agency's ability to fulfill the mandate given through the General Assembly is now seriously threatened, because UNRWA, as we talked about earlier, UNRWA really is the humanitarian backbone of the UN response because of our huge presence in Gaza prior to October 7th. We are, food is stored at our warehouses. We're managing the fuel. We're running, the Kerem Shalom crossing, the Gaza side of the Kerem Shalom crossing. This is not going to be a capability that is easily reconstituted. And part of the irony of this being, if you were to reconstitute it, it would be with the same people it would be largely with the same people. Begging the question, is the problem UNRWA and the services that humanitarian and human development services we provide, or is it the fact that UNRWA still continues to exist? That is the real issue, the real underlying issue here, as if UNRWA not feeding people, medicating people, educating people is somehow a bad thing. It's a difficult situation, and as you noted, UNRWA is larger than just Gaza. You know, we provide services in the West Bank, Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and where are these young folks going to go? Where are you going to find your health care in Syria if we go away? You know, in Lebanon, Palestine refugees are not in the regular school system, and they are barred from working in 30 professions. What happens to regional security and stability when you remove any shred of hope from these people? And we just don't see that taking a humanitarian and human development agency off the board is going to in any way, shape, or form help regional stability, let alone the tragic situation in Gaza. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate it. And I want to highlight, and let me remove the spotlight so folks can see everyone again. I want to highlight that you mentioned the starvation of the Palestinian people, and that is a very serious concern. And in addition to the infectious diseases that are spreading, again, the UN report of over 90% of children in Gaza experiencing infectious diseases, and without spreading, the death toll will rise beyond 30,000. And according to the UN Special Rapporteur, Israel, according to the UN experts, Israel is deliberately starving Palestinians. And as we saw this morning, there was open fire on Palestinian people who were waiting on food aid. And that is, of course, a war crime and constitutes a situation of genocide. With that, I want to maybe give Jehad 1 minute to share about what is the vision, what is that vision you mentioned, the new approach, and then we will close. Thank you.
Once again, the Palestinian issue is an issue of return, of liberation and self-determination. And without addressing these major, very important and existential demands that the Palestinian people have been raising for decades, I don't think there can be a path forward. And when it comes to UNRWA and its role and the question of Palestinian refugees, as I mentioned, no nation on earth, including Palestinians, want to live as refugees for eternity and rely on aid and rely on relief. But in order for this to be addressed, the bigger political questions need to be addressed as well. And that has to do with the fundamental questions about how do we envision life in this part of the world, and what are the answers. And the answers to these questions lie in coming together and listening to Palestinian voices and listening to dozens and dozens of people who historically have shared their perspective and analysis about a different path forward and different possibilities. And this is incredibly possible. It's just we need the political will. We need the political will, especially here in the United States, in light of the role the US has played in shaping and defining the reality on the ground.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing that. Thank you so much to our speakers today, Jehad Abusalim and Bill Deere. And thank you to all the attendees for making the time for this very critical briefing today. Please share your feedback by responding to the 2-question survey at the end of this Zoom call. And we look forward to staying connected. We do have a weekly roundup that's by the Institute for Middle East Understanding. We share it every Friday. And to join this listserv, if you'd like, you can feel free to email me and I'll put my email into the chat. And if you'd like to schedule a meeting with the government relations team at Institute for Middle East Understanding, you can please email me. And for timely updates from the IMEU, you can follow our social channels and I will share those in the chat. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you, Nusayba.
Thank you, Jehad.